At the rusting blue gate of Government Model School Gulshanabad, a line of boys in scuffed shoes and sun-faded sweaters pressed forward as the bell coughed out its third warning. Ayan, 12, thin as the strap of his satchel, slipped through with a brief look back toward the street where his mother would return to the office towers to mop the tiled floors. Inside, the corridor smelled of chalk and damp paper. On the wall, a cracked glass frame held the code of conduct, its ink bled by years of monsoon. Students must obey. Respect your elders. Discipline is the backbone of excellence. Near it, a wooden cane lay on top of a ledger whose corners had gone soft. The words Form 17 Discipline Register etched in the precise handwriting of Headmaster Ralph. The door to 8B squealed and then closed. A silence like a held breath followed. It happened fast. Ayan's notebook had a page torn out. Last night his sister used it to draw a flower. And when the math teacher demanded the homework, he stammered. The hand fell open-palmed and loud, the kind of sound that makes other children drop their eyes by reflex. Ayan's cheek bloomed red, and the class inhaled as one, every ribcage catching the same thin air. The teacher, heavy with his own exhaustion and the pressure of test scores, had a habit like a reflex, and reflexes justify themselves until someone names them. Ayan did not cry. He tilted his face toward the window, as if the morning could cool it. By second period, the slap had traveled faster than attendance. It wore different coats and different mouths. Insolent child, strict standards, poor boy who thinks school is charity. In the staff room, where enamel mugs left coffee rings on the table, a quieter conversation ran beneath the louder one. Nyla, who taught literature and breathes between lines the way a swimmer finds the surface, watched the door to Headmaster Ralph's office. On his desk, alongside a portrait of his own school days when belts were rules, lay a stack of fee ledgers tied with fraying string. Ralph held those ledgers like a gate. Children without receipts waited outside his office like supplicants, their futures pending in the small arithmetic of monthly dues. What happened to Ayan, Nayla knew, was not a single slap. It was the sound the system made when it exhaled on a cheap life. At the chai stall across the street, Jamila, small, quick, with a scarf tied tight against the dust, heard from a cousin's message pinging on her battered Nokia. She stood for a moment among crates of biscuits and plastic jars of toffees, looking at the school's blue gate as if it had spoken. In this neighborhood, gates tell you where you cannot go. She wiped her hands and crossed. The guard at the gate, a man with kind eyes named Kadir, glanced at the hanging board that said, "Parents access 1-2 p.m. only," then at her face. He loosened the chain and let her in without words. Sometimes compassion moves faster than rules. Sometimes it is punished afterward in the ledger. In the corridor, Jamila found Ayan outside the washroom, dabbing his cheek with water from a tap that squealed. She cupped his face lightly, thumb tracing the heat. His eyes broke then, and the first breath he had held since the slap came out as a wet hiccup. A teacher passed and looked away. Another passed and hesitated, then adjusted the scarf around her neck and kept moving. Nyla stopped. She met Jamila's gaze, then looked at the door to the headmaster's office and then at the cane on the shelf like a museum piece that no one admitted still had life. The day did not pause. The ledger pages turned in Ralph's tidy hands. The bell would ring again. The system would reset as if nothing had happened. But a small hinge had shifted. Nyla wrote a quick note in her pocket diary. 8B, 920, slap, no cause, cheek left. She put the diary in her bag as if it were a match. The school inhaled for the next hour, and the long exhale had not yet begun. By lunch, the story had drawn lines through the building like cracks in a ceiling. WhatsApp groups hummed, parents of 8B, staff announcements, Gulshanabad rumor mill. That was not official, but was more read than the circulars. A forwarded voice note began, first in anger, then in the anxious rhythm of someone building a barricade out of words. It named the teacher without naming him. It held back the boy's name like a secret kept from hungry dogs. It said what everyone knew but never wrote. Some children were slapped out of them. Other children were corrected with a smile. On the wall outside the headmaster's office, a notice pinned askew demanded that all overdue activity fees be cleared before end of week. Receipts would be checked at the gate. No receipt, no entry. If a boy like Ayan missed his day because of 20 rupees, the cane would mark him later for poor attendance. The gate and the ledger worked in tandem, a choreography that felt normal until someone pointed at the steps. Headmaster Ralph called the math teacher in and closed the door. Voices rode the corridor like wind under a door. "You know the stakes," Ralph said, tapping the fee ledger as if it were an exam script. "Our scores keep the grants flowing. No softness this year." The math teacher nodded. ashamed and stubborn at once. In his pocket, his own child's school ID card warmed against his thigh. Outside, Nayla waited. She counted to 10, then walked in without knocking. Ralph, who measured compliance by the metrics of knocks, lifted his head with surprise shading into annoyance. Nayla showed him the pocket diary entry as if it were a receipt. She asked that the incident be logged in the Form 17 with a counternote from her, and that the child be excused from classes for the day without penalty. The math teacher's jaw stiffened. Ralph stacked his ledgers more neatly, as if tidiness could control heat. He said the word procedure twice, the second time like a wall. In the courtyard, Jamila sat on a concrete bench and watched the gates. A group of mothers gathered, their bangles clicking, their voices braided with worry and the choreography of survival. They knew their children carried not just books, but the weight of their parents' unpaid bills, their fathers' tempers, their own small hungers that spiked around noon. They spoke about teachers who were kind and the few who were not, and about the way a school can turn itself into a gate, a place where you're measured before you are taught. Uncle Latif, who sold tea under a tarp year-round and knew every rumor's shape by its first sentence, leaned across his counter and said softly that when systems need defending, they find someone poor to absorb the blow. He passed Jamila a glass without charging. She pressed coins into his palm anyway. Her dignity a ledger she balanced daily. By mid-afternoon, the district education office had received 3 calls and 1 formal complaint, handwritten in Urdu by Nayla, countersigned by Jamila with a thumbprint because the letters tired her eyes after a day's work. The clerk at the district office, a man named Bashir with a stapler that clicked like a nervous habit, placed the complaint in the bottom tray. Above it lay a pile of circulars that had to go out today. Above those lay a flyer about the new exam targets. Each tray was a gate. The lower ones were further from the door. Bashir added a yellow sticky note that said, "To be reviewed," a phrase that in this building meant held until the heat cools. He adjusted his tie, which shone brighter than the walls. The math teacher, red-faced now with the acid of criticism, went back to class and taught lines and angles as if human faces had none. Ayan kept still, learning as boys learn when survival is curriculum, where to sit, to be least seen, how to breathe quietly between blows, how to make yourself small enough to pass under the gate unnoticed. That afternoon, Nayla gathered the courage she had named in private as cowardice, and sent a message to a number an old student had once given her, a number tied to a small office that did work. People did not believe could be done. "I need to report something," she typed, then deleted it and typed, "A boy was slapped without cause," then added, "This is common here." And finally, "I'm ready to put my name." She hit send. The sun slid behind cloud and the blue gate threw a longer shadow. The school took a breath it had not earned, the kind that precedes a knock that rearranges the furniture of a room. The knock came the next morning, not loud but firm, not theatrical but timed to the minute. 2 people stood at the gate with visitor badges that carried no threat and a seal that did not need flashing. The guard, Kadir, read the names, then the line that said, Office of the Education Secretary, and looked up with a flicker of hope that he tucked away like a coin for later. Behind them, the street was ordinary. A fruit cart, a motorbike idling, a girl in a sky-blue scarf balancing her satchel on the handle of her brother's bicycle. Inside the office, Headmaster Ralph adjusted his collar and told his secretary to bring tea that could carry the weight of this moment. Nyla, who had dressed in her plainest clothes so that her integrity would not be mistaken for performance, stood near the door with her pocket diary on the table. Jamila sat with her hands clasped, palms damp. The math teacher had not come in, claiming a headache. They introduced themselves, simply. The man, middle-aged, soft-spoken, carried a folder rather than a briefcase. The woman with him, younger, wore a pin with a small emblem of a book and a door. They did not start with accusations. They asked for breath. "Who is the child?" the man asked, and Jamila's mouth opened before fear could stop it. She said her son's name once like a vow. When Ayan entered, his eyes searched for exits out of instinct. The woman knelt to look him in the face, without leaning on his pain to show her kindness. She asked about the page torn from the notebook. She asked what he ate for breakfast. When he said tea, her mouth tightened, then smoothed. She took out a plain notebook and wrote his words as if inscribing law. The room was an organ of held breaths. The first exhale came from Nayla's chest. The man turned to the headmaster and asked for the Form 17. Ralph reached for the ledger with the same motion he used when a parent arrived without a receipt. He turned to yesterday's date. There was an entry about noise in a corridor, commendation for a science project, a note that a child had arrived late and been made to stand outside class for 20 minutes. There was nothing about a slap. Silence spread like ink. Nyla laid her pocket diary beside the official ledger. The difference between the two, between what is kept and what is true, lay on the desk like a thin indictment. The woman, whose name was Safa, the secretary's aide, marked the discrepancy with a neat star. Jamila gripped the arms of her chair with the steel of someone who pays in coin and bone. The man did not raise his voice. He asked about procedure. He asked who had keys to the CCTV cabinet, which sat beneath a drape of brown cloth that had not been moved in months. Bashir, the clerk, who had followed them in with his stapler like a talisman, said the cameras were a donor's initiative, and the system often failed when the generator coughed. The woman asked for the time of the alleged incident. Nyla said, "Between 9:15 and 9:25. Ayan whispered, "Just after the first bell." They lifted the drape. The monitor glowed with a screensaver that had been running unnoticed for weeks. Bashir fetched a key and a bundle of cables, as if he were retrieving an old sin. The system sputtered, then clicked into life. "Grainy, yes." But in grayscale truth, the room filled with children. A teacher's arm rising, a boy's head turned slightly away. The soundless footage made the impact visible by the flinch in 30 small shoulders. The room exhaled as if a door had finally been opened. The man closed the cabinet and thanked Bashir by name, which startled the clerk into looking ashamed rather than defensive. He said they would not end this in spectacle. He said the secretary believed in the order of care before the order of discipline. He asked that the math teacher be told to leave campus for the day to cool the air. Ralph nodded, fingers on the ledger's edges as if bracing against a gust. The man then turned to Jamila. "Your son will attend classes today," he said. "No penalties. If he wants, he can sit in the library with Ms. Nayla and read." He turned to Ayan and asked what book he liked. "Stories where the poor boy wins," Ayan said, and the room smiled without laughter. They left a sheet of paper that looked like any other circular until your eyes found the headline. "Child First Protocol," it read in steady type. "Protect first, process later." The first line, "No physical discipline under any pretext." The second, "Any allegation triggers immediate safety for the child," and "Temporary removal from duty of any staff, implicated until facts are reviewed." The third, "Logs to be made in Form 17, with incident number stamped and referenced to." CCTV, it was not dramatic. It was a hinge. The man asked to meet the staff in the assembly hall in 1 hour. He would introduce nothing new, he said, only reorder what should have come first. When they walked back out through the gate, Kadir touched the brim of his cap every guard wears without pay, and watched as the visitors' badges were placed in the tray, and then, unlike complaints, picked up again. The assembly hall smelled of varnish, warmed by sunlight. Rows of plastic chairs made a sea that could swallow dissent or lift it. Today it did both. The man from the secretary's office stood without microphone and spoke in the lower registers of authority, the range you use when you want people to hear themselves. Safa set a small projector on a table and turned it toward the wall where the school motto peeled like old paint. She did not play the slap. She played a sequence of numbers, door-to-help minutes, line by line for 5 schools that had piloted the new protocol. Incidents reported, response times, resolution within 24 hours. No child's name was shown. Only the mechanism of care, made visible like a map. Then came the ledger. Safa asked to see the fee books. Ralph, who believed that money was the spine that kept a school upright, brought them with a motion that said he guarded the place where cooperation ended and control began. She did not accuse him of theft. She asked why certain children had late fee penalty tallies that exceeded their monthly dues, why some were made to bring photocopies of receipts to pass the gate while others were waved in. She pointed to notes in the margins. Remind this parent. Ask child to fetch fees before exam. Withhold library card. The efficient cruelty of it revealed itself without adjectives. The system had made the gate a cashier and the ledger a whip. An audit team slid in with careful quiet, 2 teachers from other schools and a community volunteer. They matched Form 17 incidents with CCTV timestamps and student statements taken in the library where Nayla and Jamila sat with tea and a small shock of power. They interviewed Kadir, whose eyes were kind precisely because he could not block everything even when the sign demanded it. He admitted letting Jamila in the day before. There was a pause, as if the confession required punishment. The man said, "Thank you." He wrote "Gate discretion saved time" on a notepad that looked like a prayer. Bashir fetched files and looked increasingly like a man who had mistaken stapling for safeguarding. The exposure became clean rather than bloody. In the district office later that day, Safa projected WhatsApp screenshots, parents begging for leniency. A teacher demanding unofficial practice fees for extra sessions, the pressure of exam targets transmuted into small taxes on the poor. She read a clause from a policy circular that had been circulated every year and never enforced. Any corporal punishment is ground for immediate suspension pending review. She held it next to the blank line in the school's Form 17 for the previous day. If a rule sits unopened behind glass, it becomes a decoration like the cane on the shelf. The audit named names softly and actions plainly. It recommended immediate suspension for the math teacher, counseling for him and for students, reprimand for Ralph with conditions, and training for every staff member with signatures collected like attendance. It called for a ban on fee-related gate denials, replaced with a petty fund and a district reimbursement form that could be filed in one page rather than 4. The perverse incentive lay exposed like wire without insulation. Grants linked to exam scores and fee collection had trained schools to harden. Safa showed a line graph where test gains rose slightly as discipline hardened, but dropouts spiked and complaints fell, not because problems vanished, but because the gate learned to smile while it held firm. The man's voice did not change as he said, "We are not here to humiliate anyone. We are here to remove a gate that stood in the wrong place." He introduced a dashboard, simple as a clock, that would hang in the hall and at the gate. It would show 3 lines updated daily: door to help minutes, incidents logged versus incidents resolved. Children turned away at gate. The last metric, he said, must be 0, and on days when it was not, the number must be in red. The burden of shame would move from children's cheeks to the board, where adults could read it and change. A reporter might have wanted more drama. There was no shouting. There was a paper trail the camera could love. Receipt books with tallies. A Form 17 with a blank that mattered more than any full line. A circular titled 12B that had slept for years. The glow of a new dashboard with its 3 metrics waiting for numbers that could not be massaged. The exposure ended not with handcuffs, but with signatures. Ralph signed a commitment to the Child First Protocol, his pen catching halfway through his name as if the ink had to push through old habits. Bashir stapled the new forms onto a board, and in doing so changed what his stapler held together. Nyla signed, and then washed her hands as if a chalk dust had finally lifted. Jamila's thumbprint, pressed on a line that said, "Parent Witness," shone like a seal. Ayan, who had sat in the library reading an old story where a poor boy wins, not by luck, but by a teacher's courage, went home with a note that said, "Your child is safe." The wind off the street moved the curtain near the gate. The sign swung slightly, and for once the chain did not look like a threat. It looked like metal waiting for a new purpose. The reform arrived like a new timetable pinned on a wall where the old one had faded into a rumor. They called it, in words chosen for their plainness, the First Breath Protocol. It had 4 rules a child could recite. The first, hands off, always. The second, protect first, process later. The third, gate never denies learning. The fourth, ledger serves the child, not the other way around. The secretary's office issued a circular with a single sheet anyone could tape to their desk. At the top, a line like a drumbeat. "We will be judged by how quickly we move from harm to help." In the school hall, a board the size of a window was bolted to the wall, and Kadir, standing on a stool, helped align it until the bubble in the carpenter's level sat dead center. Below it, 3 digital counters wired to a simple tablet waited for entries. The KPIs were not born of consultancy speak. Door to Help minutes measured the time from report to the moment a child sat somewhere safe with an adult who called them by name. Incidents logged versus resolved counted truths, not gossip. Gate denials showed how often the sign had acted like a fence instead of a threshold. Each morning, Safa's team pushed an automatic prompt to the headmaster's phone and to Nayla's, asking for yesterday's numbers. If they were not entered by 9 a.m., the board flashed data pending, an embarrassment simple enough to fix. A WhatsApp complaint channel was painted on the gate in block letters, a number direct to the district with an SLA stamped beneath. Response within 60 minutes. Jamila said that in her building, the janitor read the number aloud to women who couldn't afford data. "If your child is hurt or turned away, call," he said. "Someone will come." The perverse incentive, fees and scores as the only light on the dashboard, was cut at the root. The secretary decoupled small grants from exam averages for the year and tied a portion instead to door to help, to 0 denials, to complaint resolution times. It did not end the pressure to perform. It relit it in a different room. To prevent the petty fee gatekeeping, a local petty cash drawer was established at each school, locked and dual-keyed by the headmaster and a teacher elected by staff. Receipts were replaced with a simple tick on a list that said, "Attended." and a monthly reimbursement from the district filled the drawer without parents' humiliation as an intermediary. The form to request the reimbursement fit on one page. Bashir learned to love the speed of it. His stapler quieted. Training came, and it was embarrassingly simple. They called it the 1-minute drill. Once a week at random, a bell rang 3 short chimes during break. Staff had 60 seconds to move a child from a classroom into the care corner, now a padded bench with soft light, log a mock incident with a timestamp, and show their faces in the camera that sent a still image to the district board. It felt awkward the first week. By the third, it felt like washing hands. Nyla led the exercises without making speeches. The math teacher, suspended and then returned after counseling and a formal warning, practiced saying sorry to empty rooms until the words felt less like a script and more like a gate opening. Ayan walked past him once and nodded, his chin jerking like a hinge. The man nodded back and did not look down. Culture, like breath, found a new rhythm when it had a metronome. Audit, enforcement, and follow-through lived not in one heroic visit, but in a calendar. Monthly culture checks clustered on the first Thursday. A rhythm that people could feel in their bones. Safa's team pulled random Form 17 entries and matched them with CCTV times, conversations, and the board's 3 metrics. Deviations triggered quiet calls and, if repeated, louder consequences. 2 schools in the district tried to game the numbers by logging no incidents at all. The board showed zeros that looked clean until parents' complaints rose by 15% that month. The pattern was public. The secretary visited those schools unannounced, thanked the honest teachers, and suspended the headmasters for trying to make the data pretty. The message settled into the dust that coded everything. Truth first. In Gulshanabad, the board's first week showed door to help at 11 minutes, then 9, then 6. Gate denials started at 2 and slid to 0 by Friday, and the number stayed there long enough for Kadir to treat the 0 like a friend he greets. Incidents logged versus resolved hit 100% by the second Monday. Jamila came to the gate one afternoon to bring Ayan a roti wrapped in newspaper. She stood under the board and read the numbers aloud, then laughed soft and startled, a sound people make when the gate they have pushed against for years suddenly swings in. She slipped 2 10-rupee coins into the petty drawer, a gesture not required by policy, and said to the clerk, "For the child who forgets his lunch." The clerk wrote "donation" on a scrap and smiled not because the ledger would be neat, but because the drawer now held another purpose. Headmaster. Rolf adjusted to a new shape of authority. He learned to call the district before he reached for a cane hidden in memory. He began to stand by the gate for 10 minutes each morning, greeting children by name as they entered, practicing a language he had not grown up speaking. He became the person who moved the chair away from the door so it could not be used to block entry. When the secretary visited 2 weeks later, he found Ralph watching the board with a half smile. "It tells on us," Ralph said, and the secretary nodded. "That's what it's for," he replied. The building, which had for years inhaled this neighborhood's effort and exhaled indifference, began to breathe in time with those it served. The board glowed. The ledger softened. The gate held, but as a threshold, not a test. Months later, the board's glow had become ordinary, like the hum of a refrigerator you notice only when it stops. The boredom of safety settled in. Children arrived and were taught without drama, and the first breath protocol sat like an old proverb new generations think they invented. The 1-minute drill never grew glamorous. It was a ritual like morning assembly, the bell ringing 3 small chimes that meant nothing happened, precisely because something would, someday, and practice is insurance. In the staff room, mugs still left rings and chalk still dusted sleeves, but hands did not rise in anger. The cane gathered a patina of irrelevance and then disappeared. Not confiscated, just unused into oblivion, the way bad habits die when the ledger finds new lines to carry. The dashboard's 3 numbers made small stories each day. Door to help hovered at 4 minutes, then 3. When it ticked up once to 8, Nayla's class had been in the courtyard for poetry under the neem tree, and Kadir smiled at the thought that poetry had complicated the KPI. Gate denial stayed at 0 long enough that children forgot to check the board for it. Complaints came in rare bursts and were answered quickly. The WhatsApp number on the gate faded slightly and was repainted by an older student who had learned calligraphy. He did it as part of civic duty hours that counted toward nothing anyone could test, and he did it well. The petty cash drawer refilled, emptied, refilled without drama. Bashir, who had learned to staple reforms to habits rather than to binders, began to point parents toward the drawer before they asked. Ayan moved up a class. He grew a little heavier in the cheeks. He did not become a saint for having suffered, nor a prodigy because a camera caught a truth. He learned his algebra and his verbs. He sold less often after school because a neighbor offered him a spare hour in a printing shop where the air smelled like ink and oil. He carried delivery receipts, and the feel of signing and stamping, of proof made visible and fair, made him stand slightly taller. Jamila slept a half hour more some mornings, and sometimes stood by the gate with other mothers, not to guard against catastrophe, but to gossip about exams and recipes. She looked at the board only occasionally now, the way you glance at a clock you trust. The math teacher favored gentler tools. He apologized to Ayan once, properly, in words that did not deflect. He joined a small circle of staff who mentored those new to the buildings, where old habits still scratched at the doors. When he taught angles, he drew circles as if they could include more than they excluded. He still had bad days. On those days, the protocol held him like a railing holds a tired climber. Ralph, once a gate in human form, became a door that stayed open. He wrote his own diary now, a small book where he noted the 10-minute watch he kept by the gate, the complaint answered in 40 minutes, the teacher who took a breath and changed a sentence before it became harm. Beyond Gulshanabad, the dashboard was copied, sometimes badly at first. A school in the industrial quarter hung it crooked. Another forgot to update it for a week until a parent snapped a photo and posted it, and the embarrassment did what policy could not. The secretary's office rotated the 3 numbers into radio talk shows, short segments between songs where hosts riffed on door to help like it was a cricket stat, humanized and normalized. Safa conducted quarterly audits with less ceremony than before and more patience. She learned to hear tones inside numbers, a dissonance that meant someone was cooking the books or silencing children, and she showed up with a calm that made lies feel small. The culture checks were not theater. They were rhythm. The city learned to speak a little differently about schools, not as temples of discipline or factories for scores, but as rooms where the first obligation was to protect the breath that carries learning. The phrase, "gate never denies learning," edged into parental jokes and student graffiti. It became a habit at other gates, clinics, registries, bus depots, to paint a small line next to the hours. First breath honored here. Ordinary workers, guards. Clerks, teachers, wore the authority of this sentence the way you wear a cap against rain. The leader remained what he had always been, an archetype rather than a savior, a voice that ordered care correctly and then stepped aside to let systems make music. One evening, months after the slap that had sounded like a generation clearing its throat, Ayan stopped at the gate to tie his shoelace. He rested his hand on the post, worn smooth by hands before him. Kadir nodded toward the board without looking, because he already knew what it said. The numbers were small and steady, a heartbeat normal enough to be ignored. Ayan looked out at the street where his mother walked without hurrying. He took a breath and found it met by air that belonged to him. The gate behind him did not close quickly. It stayed open, letting in those who came late, letting out those who had stayed to turn off the library light. It now did what a gate should, mark a threshold, not a threat. And in the city, behind other doors and other ledgers, that same hinge clicked, barely audible, setting a new rhythm that no one would applaud each day because that is how justice survives. By becoming boring, by becoming what everyone expects. As we close, remember the small hinge that turned a heavy door today, and how many more can swing when ordinary people refuse to look away. If you like the video, then like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your voice helps this work reach the next gate that needs opening.